When tying series of notes, and I'm going to do two different examples here, there's really only one way to do this. When you have to tie multiple notes together, we have to tie them in such a way that the tie has to be rewritten each time. So it's got a bit too big of an arc there. And this would be the correct way to do this. So you want to strive for rewriting the tie each time there's a successive note that needs to be tied, regardless of their values again. This, however, would be wrong. That would insinuate a slur, and this would be very odd. This doesn't tie all of these notes, even though conceptually in one's mind it's not a bad idea. But musically speaking, this is grammatically inaccurate. So don't draw a tie across everything. What you want is this. One more point with ties and slurs. Tie here, A flat is tied to A flat. Here an A to an A flat. This is not a tie, but a slur. Singular, right? Okay, two other things to make note of. This is also in the book, but engraved, written, scored slurs, whenever you write a slur, should be slightly thicker than ties. I doctored this one up just a little bit on here. When we're drawing these by hand, this is pretty difficult to really do without an effort. So you may or may not want to do this as much. But if you notice by looking at real, good scores, good engraved scores on, say, my favorite site, imslp.org, or hopefully in your actual musical scores, you should see that slurs are slightly thicker than the ties that are on your page. They're not identical. They shouldn't be identical. They should be just slightly, a little bit thicker than the ties. Furthermore, something that isn't usually observed is that engraved, written, or scored slurs should be more eccentric than ties. Or in other words, they should have a steeper arc than a tie. Ties have a very small arc, where a slur, even though I wrote these two notes in the same space, okay, one's an A and one's an A flat, the slur has a more eccentric angle than the tie. And it's important to note that, because when you're sight reading music, these things stand out, and they tell someone ahead of time that, oh yeah, this is a slur, oh, this is a tie. It's something that I think the brain takes in very quickly, and sometimes we don't think about saying these things without looking at these. But take a look at your scores, and hopefully what you find is that these two points are quite accurate. They should be. In a multi-voice setting, when you have more than one voice written across one or more staves, what we have to do is take the ties and actually reverse them to show when two voices are sharing a staff. For instance, this excerpt from the J.S. Bach French Suite Number 1 in D minor, it's from the Allemande, and it is measure 16, and I put down the downbeat of 17. What we have is a three-voice piece of music here. In the bass clef, we have an E flat sitting as our second voice, or our low one, where the tenor voice, let's call it, at this moment is not performing at all. There's a rest here. And notice the rest is written up above the staff, so we can see that it's a separate voice. So our first voice is sitting on the top staff. I'll put a 1 here with the circle, not to confuse it with the beat numbers that I put down here. And our first voice layer, let's call it the soprano, is playing these stemmed up pitches across the board, including this 16th rest here and this final figure in the 4th beat. So all the stems are up. Typically we would want to put this first tie right here down, because it would be on the note head side of the two notes. But the default when you're writing multiple voices, because there's a second voice layer here, let's call it tenor / alto now. Alto is probably a better term for it. But it's opposing that, so the tie has to be inverted to show that this belongs to the first voice only, not the second. It also would be a lot messier if I drew the tie right through the notes, but that's actually not the reason for it. It's that the inverse of this is because it's showing that it's an outer voice, it's a first voice, where a second voice is also playing in here. So on beat 2, the downbeat of beat 2, we've got a 16th rest by the alto voice here, and then they come in and play these pitches, and then they bow back out and go back into the bass clef. So voice 2 starts in the bass clef for a beat here, then it works its way up to the treble clef, and then works its way back down again afterward. And then the other places for the ties are here in this second voice layer, because the bottom one is the third. The second voice layer ends with this B flat right here, continuing on to a B flat tied into the downbeat of the next measure. We would want to arc this tie downward because that would be on the note head side of the notes, but because there are two voices sharing a staff, or this is a multi-voiced setting, we have to invert the tie. So we see it inverted. Same with voice 3, the bass voice here. We would want to tie this arc upward because it would then be on the note head side of the notes, but the tie is inverted because it's showing two different voices are occupying one staff here. Not to mention, it is considerably easier to read. So always invert almost everything, musically speaking. Almost all articulations are inverted when multi-voiced settings, where more than one melody is being performed on one single staff. Sometimes by a single instrument, like a clavier, clavichord, harpsichord would have played in this day, or a standard piano today. Okay, we talked about tying single notes and single voice lines, and here we'd have a single voice instrument or line as well, since they're all sharing a stem. Whenever they're sharing a stem, that means that one instrument is playing these together, either a split group of instrumentation like two sopranos, or whether maybe I'm playing it on a keyboard and it's just in a single voice setting. We could play anything like this. And whenever you're tying dyads like this, the notes comprising a dyad, or manufacturing the dyad here, two note groupings, are always tied in opposition to each other. So our old rule is that you want to tie these on the note head side. So going at it with that approach would make one think that we should do something like this. Note head sides here, I guess the same thing there, and this is what many people will do when they draw ties. This actually is wrong, however, because that's not the way you should tie dyads in a single voice setting. What we should do is tie them in opposition to each other, or in other words, the upper one will be tied up, the lower one tied underneath. Tied above for the top, tied below for the bottom. So they're always going to be in opposition to each other, regardless of their spacing apart. This is only a third, these are octaves, and if they were greater, the same rule still applies. So even with seconds, and more on that in a little bit too, but always tie dyads in opposition to each other like this.